Picture this. You're standing in the central plaza of a Maya city-state in 750 AD, and the air is thick with copal incense and something else, the metallic scent of fresh blood. The victory celebration has been going on for 3 days, but what you're about to witness will haunt you forever. A line of women, once the wives of noble warriors, are being led toward the temple steps. They're adorned in the finest jade and quetzal feathers, looking almost like goddesses themselves. But the terror in their eyes tells a different story, because everyone watching knows these women are not being honored. They are being prepared for something far worse than death itself. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of ritualistic transformation and psychological warfare, if you find yourself fascinated by the darker truths of ancient civilizations, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content that reveals what your history books left out. And please, comment below to share where you're watching from. It amazes me how we can explore these ancient mysteries together, connected across continents by our shared curiosity about humanity's most disturbing chapters. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of ancient warfare. It's the story of how the Maya turned the capture of enemy wives into a sophisticated system of spiritual domination that made death look merciful by comparison. The Maya understood something that modern minds struggle to grasp, that there are fates far worse than having your heart ripped out on a stone altar. And they perfected the art of inflicting those fates on the women who had the misfortune of being married to their enemies. Let's start with a truth that shatters our romanticized view of ancient Maya civilization. While we admire their astronomy, their mathematics, their stunning architecture, we rarely talk about their mastery of psychological warfare. The Maya didn't just defeat their enemies on the battlefield, they developed elaborate rituals designed to destroy the very essence of what made their captives human. And nowhere was this more horrifically demonstrated than in their treatment of captured wives. When Maya warriors conquered a rival city-state, their first priority wasn't gold or land, it was people. Specifically, they sought out the wives and daughters of the defeated nobility. These weren't random acts of violence. This was calculated ritualistic transformation that served multiple purposes: religious, political, and psychological. The Maya believed that by controlling the women of their enemies, they controlled the bloodlines, the future, and most importantly, the spiritual essence of their rivals. The selection process began immediately after victory. Maya priests, accompanied by warriors, would identify the wives of important enemies, war chiefs, nobles, high-ranking warriors, and especially any members of the rival royal family. These women were valuable not for ransom, but for something far more sinister. They were to become living symbols of their husband's defeat, transformed through ritual into something that would horrify their own people. What made the Maya approach unique was not just cruelty. It was the sophisticated understanding of identity and personhood. They knew that killing these women would make them martyrs. Instead, they developed rituals that would fundamentally alter who these women were, turning them into weapons against their own people's morale and spiritual beliefs. The process began the moment of capture, with rituals designed to sever the women's connection to their previous lives. The first stage was the stripping ceremony. But this wasn't just about removing clothing. The Maya systematically removed every symbol of the woman's previous identity. Her clothing, woven with patterns specific to her family and city, was burned in a ritual fire. Her jewelry, often passed down through generations and containing protective symbols, was melted down or crushed. Her hair, styled according to her status and origin, was cut in patterns that marked her as property of her captors. But the physical transformation was just the beginning. The Maya understood that true domination required spiritual transformation. These women were forced to undergo ritual purification that wasn't cleansing, but corrupting according to their own beliefs. They were bathed in cenote water mixed with the blood of their own city's captured warriors. They were forced to consume ritual drinks containing hallucinogens that would break down their mental defenses. They were subjected to sleep deprivation, sensory overwhelm, and constant ritual participation designed to shatter their sense of self. The genius of Maya psychological warfare lay in their understanding of religious identity. These women weren't just forced to abandon their gods, they were forced to publicly desecrate them. Imagine being compelled to speak curses against the deities you'd worshipped since childhood, to perform rituals that your culture considered abominations, to wear the sacred symbols of enemy gods while denouncing your own. The Maya priests orchestrating these transformations were masters of spiritual torture, knowing exactly how to target the deepest held beliefs that gave these women their sense of identity and purpose. The transformation ceremonies reached their peak during what the Maya called the rebirth rituals. These weren't celebrations of new life, but systematic destructions of old identity. The captured wives were given new names, not beautiful names, but titles that constantly reminded them of their defeat and degradation. A woman who had been called Morning Star might become She Who Weeps for Dead Warriors. A mother known as Jade Flower would be renamed Mother of Cowards. These weren't just labels. In Maya culture, names held spiritual power, and changing them fundamentally altered a person's connection to the universe, but names were only the beginning. The Maya priests understood that memory was the enemy of transformation. So they developed techniques to corrupt and confuse the captives' memories of their former lives. Women were forced to recite false histories where their husbands were cowards, their cities were built on lies, their children were cursed from birth. Day after day, night after night, they had to speak these lies until the constant repetition began to blur the line between truth and fiction in their exhausted minds. The physical markings came next. Unlike simple brandings or scarification, the Maya developed an intricate system of body modification that told entire stories of defeat and transformation. These weren't done all at once. That would have been too merciful. Instead, over weeks and months, the women's bodies became canvases for their captors' triumph. Jade plugs forced through their ears weren't decorative, but specially carved with scenes of their husbands' defeats. Tattoos applied with obsidian needles didn't just mark ownership, but depicted mythological scenes where their own gods bowed before Maya deities. The scarification rituals were perhaps the most psychologically devastating. Using stingray spines and obsidian blades, priests would carve intricate patterns that could only be read by those who understood the symbolic language. To Maya observers, these scars told stories of spiritual defeat and divine abandonment. But to the women wearing them, they were constant reminders that their bodies no longer belonged to them, that even their skin had become a medium for their enemies' messages. What made these modifications truly horrific wasn't the pain, it was the participation. The women weren't just passive victims. The Maya rituals required them to actively participate in their own transformation. They had to hold the ritual implements, speak the ceremonial words requesting each modification, even thank their captors for purifying them. This forced complicity shattered the last psychological defenses, making the women accomplices in their own dehumanization. The Maya also understood the power of corrupted motherhood. Women who had children were subjected to especially cruel psychological tortures. They were told their children had been cursed because of their mother's spiritual weakness. They were forced to perform rituals cleansing their children of their maternal influence. In some cases, they had to publicly renounce their children, declaring them orphans who had never known a mother's love. The priests would then raise these children to believe their mothers had abandoned them willingly, creating generational trauma that would echo through entire family lines. But perhaps the most diabolical aspect of Maya, psychological warfare, was the role these transformed. Women were forced to play in future conflicts. They weren't kept hidden away. They were displayed prominently during battles and negotiations. Imagine being a warrior facing the Maya in battle and seeing your own sister, transformed beyond recognition, standing with your enemies. Her scarred face tells stories of your people's defeats. Her new name mocks everything your family once stood for. Her voice, when she's forced to speak, calls out curses against her own bloodline. These women became living weapons of demoralization. The Maya would parade them in front of enemy cities before sieges, forcing them to call out to their former families and friends, telling them resistance was futile, that the gods had abandoned them, that surrender was the only option. The psychological impact was devastating. Warriors who might have fought to the death found their resolve crumbling when confronted with what their wives and daughters had become. The religious implications were equally powerful. In Maya cosmology, women held special spiritual significance as conduits between the mortal and divine worlds. By corrupting these conduits, the Maya believed they were literally severing their enemies' connection to their gods. The transformed wives were forced to perform rituals that would have been considered cosmic violations. Menstruating women handling sacred objects, mothers cursing their own bloodlines, wives calling divine wrath upon their husbands' spirits. The detail that truly reveals the sophistication of Maya psychological warfare was their understanding of hope as a tool of torture. These women weren't broken completely. That would have ended their usefulness. Instead, they were kept in a constant state of partial transformation, always believing that complete submission might end their torment, that perfect performance of their new identity might earn them some small mercy. This false hope kept them compliant while ensuring their suffering remained fresh and visible. Some women tried to resist through suicide, seeing death as the only escape. But the Maya had anticipated this. Women who attempted to take their own lives were revived when possible and subjected to even more intensive transformation rituals. They were told that suicide would curse their entire bloodline, that their children and grandchildren would suffer for their cowardice. The combination of religious fear and maternal instinct kept many women trapped in lives that had become elaborate performances of their own degradation. The transformation rituals reached their most sadistic phase during what the Maya called the marriage ceremonies. Yes, you heard that correctly. These women, already stripped of their identities and marked as property, were subjected to forced remarriages that represented the ultimate violation of their personhood. But these weren't simple transfers of ownership. The Maya had developed an intricate system of spiritual bondage that made conventional slavery look almost humane by comparison. Picture the scene in a Maya ceremonial plaza. The captured wife of a defeated noble is brought forward, her body telling the story of months of systematic transformation. She's dressed in the traditional wedding garments of her captors, but every detail has been corrupted to mock her origins. The feathers in her headdress are from birds considered unclean by her people. The jade ornaments she wears are carved with images of her former gods in positions of submission. Even the flowers in her hair are species that her culture associated with death and decay. The groom in these ceremonies wasn't chosen randomly. The Maya priests selected men who would maximize the psychological damage. Sometimes it was the warrior who had personally killed the woman's husband, forcing her to share a bed with her spouse's executioner. Other times it was men of deliberately lower status, servants or foreigners, ensuring that a woman who had been married to nobility was now bound to someone her culture would have considered beneath contempt. But perhaps most cruel were the marriages to priests of enemy gods, men who represented everything these women had been taught to fear and despise. The ceremony itself was a masterwork of psychological torture, disguised as religious ritual. The woman had to speak vows renouncing her previous marriage, declaring that her former husband had been weak, unworthy, cursed by the gods. She had to request her new marriage, beg for it even, performing rituals of submission that would have been unthinkable in her former life. The Maya scribes recorded these ceremonies in detail, preserving for eternity the words these women were forced to speak against everything they had once held sacred. But the true horror of these marriages wasn't the ceremony, it was what came after. These women weren't just expected to be wives in name only. They were required to bear children for their new husbands, children who would be raised to despise their mother's origins. The Maya understood that forcing these women to bring new life into the world under these circumstances was a form of torture that cut deeper than any physical wound. Every child born was a living reminder of their transformation, a biological chain binding them to their captors forever. The psychological complexity of these situations defies modern comprehension. These women had to navigate impossible emotional territories. They were expected to show affection to men they despised, to nurture children whose very existence represented their violation, to perform domestic rituals that mocked their former lives. Any sign of reluctance was met with punishment not just for them, but for any surviving members of their families. The Maya had perfected the art of using love as a weapon, turning the captive's own capacity for emotion into chains stronger than any physical restraint. The children born from these unions occupied a unique and terrible position in Maya society. They were living symbols of conquest, raised with full knowledge of their origins, but taught to despise their maternal heritage. These children were often given names that reflected their dual nature: born of victory, child of the broken eagle, daughter of two worlds. They were educated in special schools, where they learned to view their mother's transformations as divine justice, necessary corrections to cosmic imbalance. What made the system particularly effective was its public nature. These transformed wives weren't hidden away in private households. They were required to participate in public ceremonies, religious festivals, and social gatherings. Other Maya women were encouraged to treat them with a mixture of pity and contempt, while captured women from new conflicts were shown their fate through these living examples. The message was clear: resistance led not to death, but to something far worse. A living death that could span generations. The religious ceremonies these women were forced to perform became increasingly elaborate and disturbing. During certain festivals, they had to lead rituals explicitly designed to curse their former cities and families. They would stand before the entire community and recite litanies of their people's supposed crimes against the gods, call down divine punishment on their former homes, and thank the Maya deities for showing them the truth about their previous lives. The priests had crafted these ceremonies to require genuine emotion: tears, trembling voices, visible signs of distress that couldn't be faked. Some of the most heartbreaking accounts tell of women who were forced to participate in rituals against their own captured children. The Maya would sometimes take young sons of defeated nobles and raise them as warriors for their own armies. Their transformed mothers would have to perform blessing ceremonies, asking Maya gods to make their sons strong in battle against their own people. Imagine the psychological torture of having to pray for your child to become an effective killer of your own relatives, to speak words, hoping they would forget their true heritage and fully embrace their captor's culture. The Maya also understood the power of false kindness as a tool of control. Periodically, these women would be given rewards for good behavior: a day of better food, a small comfort, even a brief reduction in their ritual obligations. But these moments of mercy were calculated to maintain just enough hope to prevent complete despair, while simultaneously reminding the women that every aspect of their existence was controlled by their captor's whims. The unpredictability of these rewards and punishments kept the women in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing whether compliance would bring relief or simply new forms of torment. The physical transformations these women endured went far beyond surface modifications. The Maya had developed something even more sinister: ritualistic procedures designed to alter the captive's fundamental life functions in ways that bound them permanently to their new existence. They understood that true control meant making it physically impossible for these women to return to their former lives, even if they somehow escaped. Consider the dietary transformations. The Maya priests didn't just change what these women ate. They systematically altered their body's ability to process their traditional foods. Through months of forced consumption of specific plant mixtures, combined with ritual fasting and deliberate nutritional manipulation, they created dependencies on foods that were only available in Maya territories. Women who tried to eat the corn, beans, or squash prepared in their traditional ways would become violently ill. Their bodies had been reprogrammed to accept only the ritual foods of their captors, making physical escape meaningless when they couldn't survive on their homeland's sustenance. The Mayas' knowledge of medicinal plants extended to darker purposes. They administered regular doses of herbs that altered the women's hormonal cycles, linking them to Maya lunar ceremonies rather than their own cultural calendars. These botanical interventions affected everything from menstruation to emotional regulation, creating physical dependencies that reinforced psychological control. A woman whose body now responded to Maya ceremonial cycles rather than her own cultural rhythms was alienated from her very biology. But perhaps the most diabolical innovation was what the Maya called dream slavery. Through combinations of psychoactive plants, sleep deprivation, and ritual conditioning, they invaded the one realm that should have remained private, the captive's dreams. Women reported that even in sleep, they couldn't escape their transformation. Their dreams were filled with Maya symbolism, their nightmares populated by their own gods abandoning them. Some women became afraid to sleep, knowing their unconscious minds had been colonized as thoroughly as their waking lives. The linguistic transformation was equally systematic. The Maya didn't just force these women to speak a new language. They corrupted their ability to speak their native tongues. Through a combination of punishment for using certain words, forced mispronunciation of sacred terms, and the introduction of Maya linguistic elements into their original languages, they created a horrific hybrid speech that marked these women as neither fully Maya nor recognizably their original culture. Imagine trying to pray to your childhood gods, but finding the words twisted in your mouth, coming out as blasphemies or praise for your captors' deities. The social isolation techniques were masterfully cruel. These women weren't just separated from their families. They were placed in carefully constructed social situations designed to maximize their psychological discomfort. They might be housed with women from enemy cultures who had traditional animosities with their people. They were forced to form friendships with the wives of men who had tortured their loved ones. Every social interaction became a minefield of historical hatred, forced cooperation, and the constant reminder that authentic human connection was another casualty of their transformation. The Maya also perfected the use of children as instruments of torture. Not just the women's own children, but Maya children were trained to participate in the captive's humiliation. Young Maya girls would be assigned as daughters to these transformed wives, calling them mother while simultaneously reporting any signs of resistance. These children were taught songs mocking the captive's origins, games that recreated their husbands' defeats, and stories where the women's former cultures were portrayed as primitive and cursed. The captives had to endure this constant childish cruelty while showing maternal affection to their tormentors. The religious calendar became another tool of systematic torture. Maya festivals often required these women to perform roles that directly violated their original spiritual beliefs. During harvest ceremonies, they might have to offer the first fruits to Maya gods while speaking curses against their own harvest deities. In fertility rituals, they were forced to ask Maya goddesses to make them fruitful, while simultaneously thanking them for making their original homeland barren. The cosmic implications of these forced blasphemies weighed heavily on women who genuinely believed in divine retribution. Some of the most sophisticated tortures involved corrupting the captives' role as healers and midwives. Many noble women had been trained in traditional medicine and childbirth assistance. The Maya forced them to use this knowledge in perverted ways, preparing medicines that would weaken their own people's children, assisting in births while speaking Maya blessings instead of their traditional protective chants, even creating healing mixtures that actually increased dependency on Maya remedies. The violation of their healing oaths and maternal instincts created profound psychological conflicts. The record-keeping aspect reveals just how calculated this system was. Maya scribes maintained detailed accounts of each woman's transformation, documenting not just physical changes, but emotional breakdowns, moments of resistance, and signs of acceptance. These records were studied to refine the torture techniques, identifying which methods were most effective for women of different ages, social standings, and cultural backgrounds. The transformation of captive wives had become a horrific science, with each woman's suffering contributing data to perfect the system. The few archaeological remains that hint at these practices are chilling. Burial sites showing women with Maya modifications alongside artifacts from enemy cultures. Ceramic figurines depicting transformation ceremonies. Most haunting are the glyphs that seem to record new names given to these captives, names that translate to concepts like she who forgot her, children, or dancer, for enemy gods. These fragments of evidence support the horrific accounts, preserved in later indigenous testimonies. The final fate of these transformed women represents perhaps the cruelest chapter in this dark history. As they aged, as their beauty faded and their ability to bear children ended, they didn't find release from their torment. Instead, the Maya had developed specific roles for elderly transformed wives that extended their suffering into their final years and even beyond death. These women became living libraries of defeat, forced to teach younger captives the songs of submission, the rituals of transformation, the proper way to forget one's identity. The position of keeper of sorrows was reserved for the oldest transformed wives. These women were required to maintain the ritual items used in transformation ceremonies, the obsidian blades that scarred new captives, the ceremonial garments that mocked their origins, the sacred texts that recorded their own violations. They had to train Maya priests in the subtle art of psychological destruction, sharing the intimate details of what had broken them most effectively. Imagine being forced to perfect the very techniques that had destroyed you, knowing you were helping to condemn other women to your fate. But the Maya's conception of suffering didn't end with death. They believed that proper ritual control could bind these women's spirits even in the afterlife. The transformed wives were buried with specific grave goods designed to continue their servitude in the underworld. Their tombs contained Maya religious items they would have considered blasphemous, inscriptions declaring their eternal bondage to their captors' gods, and most horrifically, representations of their transformed state that would supposedly maintain their corrupted identity forever. The archaeological evidence of these burials is deeply disturbing. Skeletons showing the physical modifications, surrounded by artifacts from two cultures arranged to show the dominance of one over the other. Some burial sites contain what appear to be ritual kills of the women's original cultural items, pottery deliberately smashed, textiles burned and the ashes interred, jewelry melted and reformed into Maya religious symbols. Even in death, these women were denied any connection to their origins. The generational impact of this system created waves of trauma that rippled through centuries. Children of transformed wives grew up in a twilight existence, never fully accepted by Maya society, but completely severed from their maternal heritage. These children often became the most zealous enforcers of the transformation system, as if by participating in the destruction of other women's identities, they could somehow resolve their own fractured existence. The Maya had created a self-perpetuating cycle of cultural annihilation, and that required minimal maintenance once established. Some of the most heartbreaking evidence comes from the few instances where transformed wives attempted to preserve some fragment of their original identity. Archaeologists have found hidden caches of small items, a bead from their homeland, a fragment of textile with traditional patterns, even what appear to be attempts to write their original names in hidden places. These pathetic remnants of resistance show that even under the most comprehensive system of identity destruction, some spark of the original person fought to survive. The Maya priests who oversaw the system left records that reveal a disturbing pride in their work. They developed philosophical and religious justifications for the transformation process, viewing it as a cosmic correction, a way of maintaining universal balance by properly ordering human relationships. In their worldview, these women's suffering wasn't cruelty, but necessary spiritual adjustment. The priests saw themselves as artists of human transformation, sculpting new beings from the raw material of captive wives. What's particularly chilling is how the Maya integrated the system into their broader understanding of gender and power. The transformation of enemy wives became a fundamental part of how they conceptualized victory itself. A war wasn't truly won until the wives of the defeated had been successfully transformed. Military campaigns were planned with this goal in mind, sometimes targeting specific women known for their beauty, intelligence, or spiritual significance. The capture and transformation of a particularly important wife could be considered more valuable than conquering territory or securing tribute. The system's effectiveness led to its adoption and modification by various Maya city-states, each adding their own refinements to the basic template of identity destruction. Some cities specialized in pharmaceutical modifications, others in religious conversion techniques, still others in the use of children as tools of control. This horrific innovation created a kind of competition among Maya elites to develop ever more effective methods of transforming captive wives. The collapse of this system came not from moral awakening, but from practical complications. As Maya city-states weakened from internal conflicts and external pressures, maintaining the elaborate transformation infrastructure became impossible. The last transformed wives found themselves in an even more tragic position. Their captors no longer had the resources to maintain their artificial dependencies, but they had been too thoroughly changed to return to any normal existence. Many simply disappeared from historical records, their final fates unknown. Modern Maya descendants often struggle with this aspect of their heritage. How do you reconcile pride in your ancestors' achievements with knowledge of such systematic cruelty? Some argue these practices must be understood in their historical context, while others see them as warnings about the human capacity for sophisticated evil. The transformed wives have become uncomfortable ghosts in cultural memory. their suffering too extreme to romanticize, but too important to forget. What does this hidden history teach us? Perhaps that human cruelty becomes most dangerous when it develops systematic, sustainable methods. The Maya didn't just hurt these women, they created an entire infrastructure of suffering that perpetuated itself across generations. They turned transformation into a science, identity destruction into an art, and human beings into living monuments to their own empire's power. In seeking to completely dominate their enemies, they revealed the darkest possibilities of human innovation. The story of Maya, transformed wives, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about civilization itself. These weren't primitive people acting on savage impulses. They were sophisticated urban dwellers who used their advanced knowledge of psychology, pharmacology, and social engineering to perfect human suffering. If such horrors could arise from one of humanity's most accomplished civilizations, what does that say about the potential for cruelty that lies dormant in all complex societies? The transformed wives of the Maya stand as eternal warnings. That power without empathy, innovation without ethics, and victory without mercy can create hells more terrible than any religious vision of damnation.